Good afternoon. This is Bill Hamblett. I'm the editor-in-chief of proceedings at the U.S. Naval Institute, broadcasting today from the broadcast center, the broadcast studio of the Jack C. Taylor Conference Center here at Beach Hall at the Naval Institute on the grounds of the Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. And before I get to our guest today, I want to just highlight a couple things going on here at the Institute. So the July issue of proceedings is out. Obviously, we're now just a couple days after the 4th of July weekend, and I hope everyone had a good, safe, it obviously was not for all Americans, a good, safe holiday, celebrating our Independence Day. Torn up about, of course, what happened out in Highland Park, Michigan. So we put out the July issue of proceedings late last fall. The title is the Maritime Coin Project, or Maritime Coin. So that is a package of content, about 35 pages or so in the July issue, centered around the topic of what China's been doing in the South China Sea and how the United States and our allies and partners might push back against Chinese nefarious, illegal activity there. It's getting quite a bit of attention right now. So we've had some media inquiries. I talked to a Voice of America reporter last night about the topic. The lead author and the organizer, Hunter Stiers, has been getting quite a few inquiries as well. So we look forward to a very lively debate and discussion on that topic, and we have more articles coming up in the months to come. So I wanted to highlight that. Also coming up on the 13th of July, so next Wednesday, we'll be having a maritime security dialogue. Our very own Ward Carroll will be interviewing the Air Boss, Vice Admiral Ken Weitzel, and a couple of other flag officers who are senior in the U.S. Navy naval aviation community. And that will be on the stage in the main auditorium of the Jack C. Taylor Conference Center. And so we look forward to having the first Maritime Security Dialogue event here in our home field advantage. So the Maritime Security Dialogue series is something that we've been doing for multiple years now with the Center for Strategic and International Studies down in Washington, D.C., usually at their facility on Rhode Island Avenue. But it's nice that now that we've got the Jack C. Taylor Conference Center, that we can do a Maritime Security Dialogue event here as well. So those are the flashing news right now, and I'll get to our guest. So joining us today is an author and a reserve Navy officer, Lieutenant Commander Eric Seligman. He is both a cyber warfare officer in the Navy, or information warfare community officer in the Navy, and in his civilian capacity, he is responsible for offensive security and red teaming for Intuit. So he is a true cybersecurity expert. There aren't a lot of those. A lot of them profess to be, but he is one of the actual real ones. So Eric, Commander Seligman, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Bill.
So your article is called "There Is No Cyber Bullet." It shows up on pages 74, 75 of the July issue of Proceedings. I love this. I was an information warfare, corps person, information dominance corps, naval intelligence officer. Towards the end of my career, there was a lot of discussion about cyber capabilities, and I retired in 2016. But what I sensed a lot was that there was, and I even referred to your article in my editor's page this month. I said that quite often it's hard to plan for cyber capabilities. They're held very in very tight channels because we don't want those capabilities to be known necessarily. They can be a very fleeting capability, as your article points out, and often in terms of for planners and in exercisers, there's a bit of sprinkling cyber on a problem, and to those who aren't experts, it can be hard to tell and hard to know what the real capability is, or even how to actually plan that capability into a campaign, into a tactical operation, into actually accomplishing something in the real physical space. So your piece, I just resonated with me. It resonated with our editorial board when we read it. Just a terrific article that I think grounds the discussion in ways that the discussion has not been grounded before. So, I turn it to you, just a little bit of, from the 30,000 foot perspective to start off. You use a very graphic comparison between a Mark 82 general purpose bomb and a cyber tool. So explain that comparison to our listeners.
Yeah, and it's not so much a direct comparison, right? It's more of an anti-analogy, if you will, because we know that physical weapons are supposed to have a very direct kinetic effect on a target. We know that it will impart a certain amount of kinetic energy, and eventually those bombs will break, destroying the target, even if we apply more bombs, if that's what it takes. That is not necessarily the case in cyber, and so when we talk about physical weapons, we talk about the specificity of their effects. And in cyber, having specific effects is very difficult, given sort of the broad-ranging environmental issues that we have within what we term cyberspace. Because indeed, that fifth domain of warfare, the cyber domain, essentially is continuously shifting under our feet. And if we don't know, the left and right boundaries of where that environment is and what the targets we're going after, it makes it very difficult to explicitly say, I'm going to have this specific cyber effect on this specific target, and this is exactly what it's going to do. And so that's kind of the premise of the article, is trying to get to that understanding that it can be difficult without the appropriate preparation of the environment to actually execute the kinds of cyber effects we want at the tactical level. And that's really the thrust of the article.
So I love the fact that your article, you talk through a number of the myriad, limitations that there are on a cyber weapon. And, and you back to that Mark 82 anti-analogy. There's a thing in the military called JMEMS, the Joint Munitions Effects Manual. I think it's called JMEMS. It's been a while since I pulled out a JMEMS manual. But you can look at your weapon. You can look at the thing that you want to have an impact on, an effect on. You can look at fusing. You look at redundancy issues, and you can predict. Okay, if I hit this target within X number of feet, this is going to happen. And yet your article lays out the multiple different ways that is not true. Those physical characteristics are just not true for cyber effects. Explain that a bit.
Yeah. So, again, sorry.
We're getting some feedback there.
All right. Okay. I think we're better now. Right. To answer the question, we want to be able to catalog weapons as specifically as possible, right? We need to know what their effects ultimately are going to be. And the thing is, with cyber weapons, the permanence of their effects can be fleeting, right? We know that. We know that potentially the target that we want to actually provide effects against can also change significantly as well. We also know the more that we use a cyber weapon, the more likely it is that there'll be a countermeasure for it. And the ability to make countermeasures against cyber weapons is extremely easy, or can be, in cyberspace. All it takes is an understanding of the vulnerability that is being attacked, or an understanding of the signature of the weapon that's going to be attacked. So if I know, the specific byte sequence going over the network of a particular attack that I know is going to take out, let's say a radar installation, I can put that in my firewall and it's going to be blocked. Or if I know that it's going up against a specific vulnerability that was previously undiscovered, but then I see you acting against that vulnerability, I can make a patch for that and fix it. And so mitigating cyber weapons is much, much easier than it is mitigating physical weapons. And that's also why I kind of emphasize the necessity of covert nature of cyber weapons, because without that covert nature, it becomes very, very difficult to have weapons that have both enduring effects and have a long shelf life.
So just pulling the string a little bit more on that, you mentioned, you say, consider just one potential variable when designing a cyber weapon, the target's operating system. And then you say this may seem simple to account for. Note that Microsoft has released 14 major versions of its OS in the past 15 years, and then multiply that by two because there's an iOS version and there's a PC version, right? So you're talking many, so if you're
Right.
developing a weapon, you got to, which OS are you talking about and on which type of system is it operating?
Exactly. And it's not just the patch level, or rather, it's not just the operating system, right? It's also the patch level. It's also the software that's installed on the target. It is the computer network defense mechanism, so the endpoint security, like McAfee or Symantec, that may be installed. It also may be the target state of the network, so there could be some kind of degradation within the network. There could be memory problems within the computer system. Maybe it hasn't been rebooted in 10 years, So there's all kinds of things that could be happening on the target system that we simply cannot account for. And so when we think about utilizing those cyber weapons, we have to understand, again, the ephemeral nature of the target space that we're talking about.
So for those of us who are less computer literate, to talk a little bit about, without going into classified details at all, but talk a little bit about the process of somebody at U.S. Cyber Command, or even, you are an offensive cyber person at Intuit for a private software company. Talk about some of the process that goes into creating a weapon or a capability, an offensive capability.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what most things, in terms of what has to happen first, there has to be a requirement. Someone has to say, I need an effect generated against this specific target. And so once a specific target has been identified, or at least a class of targets, then it goes into essentially what is R&D mode. So we first look and see if there's any publicly available exploits available for it. The likelihood that these will work is pretty low, but it could potentially give someone a starting point for iterating on that particular work. Once we look at publicly available exploitation vectors, we then kind of look into our internal stock of weapons to see if there's something that was done in the past that maybe could again be retooled to attack that particular target. Once that's done and we can affirm that there isn't something already in the available stock to provide that type of effect against the target, we then basically start researching vulnerabilities for that. So that's going to involve creating sort of a virtualized facsimile of the specific target and building out software against what they perceive to be potential vulnerabilities. So they're going to iterate through all of the various functions and the memory states and other vectors that could potentially be utilized to again impact and affect against this particular system. And once that's done, they have a potential lead. They'll start again being very specific in terms of what kind of effects delivery that we can have against that given target. So assuming that you've actually found a potential vector in that system, you then have to think about, all right, I can bypass the security of this particular target. What can I do after that? Can I install some kind of persistent command and control? Can I directly modify the system, sort of living off the land to give me continual access? And once you've kind of determined what kind of access you have after that, then you have to determine how long you'll actually be able to stay in the system with that particular kind of access, whether it be inherent to the system or something that you have deployed on the system. And ultimately, that's going to determine what kind of effect you can ultimately have against the specific target that you're going after, and how long you'll have it. Because the ideal end state is that you have access to this system in perpetuity, and that any time you need to generate an effect against it, you can just dial up the target, hit a button, and then that effect is going to be generated. In reality, it doesn't always work out like that, but generally speaking, that's how the process would be executed.
We hear a lot about Chinese and Russian and North Korean and Iranian, computer network exploitation and attacks against everything from, civilian targets, including gasoline pipelines and on the East Coast of the United States to voting machines, perhaps. Is there do those nations have a different process, or is the process the same as what you just described? Is everybody got to go through the same process to create a cyber capability, a cyber weapon, if you will?
Yeah. So in terms of research and development, yes, that technical process is essentially the same. Where they have an advantage is that the United States tends to hold offensive cyber capabilities very close to a handful of agencies and a handful of government agents, whereas China and Russia, they distribute that across the totality of their workforce. So not just governments, but they allow universities to play, they allow private entities, and in the case of Russia, they allow criminal enterprises to play as well. And so the breadth of the people that they allow to develop these weapons and to go after targets is much broader than what we allow in the U.S., for better or worse.
Hey, there's a question from Robert Elliott, one of our viewers, and he says, "Can we stockpile these munitions? Doesn't the rate of upgrades create the use or lose dynamic? Don't they have a shelf life?"
Absolutely. So you may be lucky in that you find what is sometimes termed as the skeleton key exploit that allows you to exploit some fundamental underpinning of the internet or of an operating system. But those are very, very rare and far between. And so in many cases, if you develop an exploit, even if you don't use it, it will have a usability drift, meaning that if you don't use it within a period of a few months or a few years, depending on what the patching cycle is of your given target, it will absolutely be less useful as time goes on. It may be very quickly rendered inert in totality.
Yeah, that's a great point. Great question, Robert. Appreciate that. So my next question is, if there's no cyber bullet, that anti-analogy that you started with, is there a better analogy for cyber weapons and capabilities?
Yeah. So I've been thinking about this question a lot. And if we can't make an analogy of a bullet, and we can't make it a missile or anything else like that, is it really worth trying to make an analogy at all? Or is it really a question of education and educating people, what this thing is? Like, we all know and understand kind of what like a space shuttle is, right? Because we've seen it, we know what it is. But if we go back 100 years and try and tell people what a space shuttle is, it'd be very difficult because they don't have the experience and the educational background to do so. So I haven't come up with an analogy that works for everyone, other than to say I think we need to start injecting cyber education much earlier in the training of our officers and in the training of our leadership, in addition to the population at large too, so that we don't have to create sort of clunky analogies to try and describe what is really a very complicated process that requires a lot of education and understanding to have. So I know that's not it's a bad answer to a good question, but that's what I have.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Education is always incredibly important, especially as technology brings us into new places, and we're trying to figure out how to talk about them, communicate about them, and develop tactics and operations and concepts for using them. Right. Your article does bring out you use the term the thief, the lockpicker, and the saboteur, which that was helpful to me, as I was reading it. Okay, I get it that it's not like a Mark 82, it's not a bullet or a bomb. What is it more like? And those analogies did help me understand at least that, okay, there's an aspect of having to, pick your way, the lock picker, get into a system. So you got to have that access, and then you got to stay stealthy. You got to be, a thief. You've got to be hidden while you're there, or else if you're discovered, then you're done. Then your capability's gone. And then you've got to, at some point, be able to sort of sabotage the system, right? So there's that aspect of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can definitely make analogies for the behaviors that we're performing. The weapons analogy is a little bit more difficult, right? But in terms of what we're actually doing on a target, I think those are, the best analogies that I could come up with, and it really speaks again to the necessity for covert action when we're performing cyber exploitation and rendering its effects. I also speak in there about the wants to do show of force exercises show of force exercises within cyber and kind of demonstrate our capability to our adversaries. And I argue strongly against things like that. The most effective cyber attack is the one that the enemy doesn't even realize is occurring. Their weapon misses by a meter, or it fails to launch because of what appears to be some kind of mechanical failure, or the radar pictures just ever so slightly askew. Things like that, where it appears to just be bad engineering versus a spectacular failure. Those are the kind of cyber effects that will be enduring and most effective over the long run, in my opinion.
That's a great point. So I want to I'm going to go off script a little bit and ask you a question about popular culture and the movies. So Top Gun Maverick is in theaters, and so everybody from we're all talking about that movie and comparing it to its predecessor. And you've got to suspend disbelief a little bit when you walk into the theaters and you watch Tom Cruise on the screen, and it's a great. I think it's a great movie, but of course it's not really true to life of how operations happen on an aircraft carrier, and the that tactical operation, a little bit far-fetched. But I want to ask you, do you have a favorite movie that has a cyber scene in it? So that's such a theme these days in movie plot lines, is somebody hacking into a system and providing the remote lock opening or the access to bring the security system down. Anything in the movies that Hollywood's put out there that you say, yeah, that was pretty good, that was actually one of the better ones?
Yeah, it's interesting. Most of the military-based movies kind of have this, fantastical, three-dimensional graphical overlay where the person is traveling through cyberspace or what have you, and comes to the target, and then it goes like that. It's not anything like that at all. It's a very typically very simple interface, simple prompts, command line inputs, things like that. But strangely enough, the movie that I think probably represented this the best was the Matrix, the trilogy of movies. Obviously, a very fantastical concept in general, but in terms of what was actually on the screen when they were doing their so-called hacking, it was actually quite realistic, and I believe they actually used some real exploits on film for that. So it was pretty interesting.
Oh, that's great to know. Yeah, I was a huge fan of those movies, so love them. Back to a minute ago, you mentioned you're not a fan of this idea of show of force, right? And there's been a lot of discussion, I think, particularly before and just as the Russian campaign in Ukraine kicked off, this whole discussion of deterrence, and are there things in cyberspace that would act as a deterrent, to the Russians? There was a whole talk about, perhaps things that could be done to their economic and banking systems and those kinds of things. But I think you've made a very good point there, that this is, if you do something as a show of force, which is often what we do for deterrence. We steam an aircraft carrier strike group through the Taiwan Straits famously in 1996. We fly bombers, in airspace close to, maybe Iran or North Korea when they're getting ready to do something. But we show military force. Is there a deterrent capability? Is there a way to deter in cyberspace?
Yeah, and that's a very good question and a complex question as well. Because if you look at our adversaries, if you look at what China does, an intellectual theft of trillions of dollars of IP over decades, or what Russia has done in regards to their information warfare campaigns and other things, they don't even claim that they've done it. They don't even say that this was us. It's just something that happens, and so it's very interesting for them that the most potent thing that they can do in cyberspace is not proclaim that they have functionality, but going out and executing it. And I think there's potentially a lesson to be learned there, in that if you execute a cyber attack and no one knows it came from you, or even if it didn't come from you, the fact that people believe that you might have perpetrated something is in a sense a powerful weapon in and of itself. And beyond that, I think in terms of what we can do to sort of officially put something in doctrine that would provide a cyber deterrence, essentially what we can do is state, hey, these are the bodies that we're creating in terms of like the cyber mission teams and the cyber national mission teams and so forth. This is the giant enterprise that we are putting together to perform cyber warfare. And hey, adversaries, look at this. We got a lot of people, a lot of energy, and a lot of focus going into this, and we are here to protect this domain. And if you don't, abide by the rules, we have the capability to do things about it. What those things are, you won't know until it happens to you, so, or maybe not even then.
So we have, I don't know if you know him, Tyson Meadows is a member of our editorial board, and he's also an information warfare community cyber warfare engineer, and he's now active in the chat function here, and he makes a couple of points. I'll just read the points, and maybe you can give your thoughts on them. He says that opinion about effective versus less effective cyber actions is not backed by a recent example or political reality. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's a difficult thing to respond to, because I need to know exactly what he's talking about in terms of that political reality. But the efficacy of cyber weapons, it depends on if you're trying to generate a specific effect or you're trying to gain access to something. Obviously, in the access example, you either have access to a certain degree or you don't. And the effects question is what type of effect you're trying to generate and to what degree. So I'd like to understand exactly what example he's referring to.
Gotcha. Well, he may type more into the chat window here. While if he does, I just have a follow-on, and it's what you just mentioned about being able to know the effects. Gets me back to your Mark 82 anti-analogy, right? So I spent a lot of my time in the naval aviation community as an intelligence officer. So I'm a targeteer. I went through joint targeting school. I understand the Mark 82 very well. I understand what a Tomahawk can do and how JMEMS works and how do you put together a strike package and all those things. And there's go no go criteria for missions where before the F-18 goes feet dry over the beach, we want to know that air defense system is down, right? That's the most threatening air defense system, for example, right? But if you're counting on a cyber weapon to deliver that effect, would you even know? I guess that's my question. It gets to your point about the subtlety of the best weapons are those where the person, the enemy, doesn't really know that it was a cyber weapon that's impacting him. He just knows that his radar's not working.
Yeah.
Right?
So the deployers, in most cases, should know whether or not the weapon was effective. Not necessarily in all cases, depending on what the specific effect calls for. But at that same time, you should also be very aware of the environment that you're going into. So you need to know the specific, computer network defenses that are set up. You need to have eyes on what the incident responders are going to be doing, depending on what types of activities, if you've triggered them or not, and any other kind of environmental factors like network links and memory allocations and things like that, like I've discussed before. All of those are factors that should be being monitored by those who are going after targets. And then the efficacy of the targeted effects should be known in at least the first and second degrees in most cases, but the third order, fourth order, and so on effects can be very, very difficult to predict in some cases.
Gotcha. So Tyson came up with an example. So he says delaying Putin's recent speaking event by a few hours wasn't at all subtle, was likely not a particularly sophisticated attack, but achieved a significant political victory on the Ukrainian side. So I don't know if you're more familiar with that one. I was not aware of that.
I was not aware of that, but absolutely, spectacular effects can be very effective in the short term. So, but my question would be, whatever weapon or methodology was used to affect that attack, will it be able to be used again now that they know it happened? So that's the kind of the premise I'm getting across.
Gotcha. Great point. Okay, well, we've come to the end of our time here. This has been a terrific conversation, and for our listeners, again, our guest is Lieutenant Commander Eric Seligman. He is the author of the article in the July issue of Proceedings. It is called "There Is No Cyber Bullet." To understand how to use cyber effects, commanders must first understand their limitations. And as I said, I'm not an expert on cyber, but this is one of the most powerful articles that I've read because it grounds you so well in an analogy and an anti-analogy that's particularly helpful to explain the differences between a cyber capability and a physical kinetic capability that perhaps more of our listeners and readers are familiar with. So well done, really, really nicely, greatly written, tense, terse, tight, and just very useful. So I hope that this one gets a lot of attention.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Bill. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, Eric. Well, it's great to have you on the show. Thanks again, and hope you'll write for us again.
Absolutely.
Well, that wraps up another episode of the Proceedings podcast. I want to thank our producer, Heather Legg. The show is brought to you by the members of the Naval Institute. Since 1873, our members have been the foundation of everything we do. To become a member, go to usni.org/join. Until next episode, remember, victory begins at the Naval Institute.